Climate change is on many people's minds these days. Its disastrous effects are in the news all the time, ranging from increased prevalence of floods and bigger storms to more extensive droughts and heat waves. Under the second Trump administration, the United States has turned its back on efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change, however. The president himself, in fact, went to the United Nations in September to tell the world that he thought climate change was the biggest con job the world had ever witnessed. The fastest warming region in the United States is Alaska, and so now is a good time to have more conversations about how climate change is affecting Alaska, and to use this occasion also to highlight the connections between human rights and climate change. I am Mathias Risse, co-host of Justice Matters, and I'm here today with Robin Bronen, who just retired from the Alaska Institute for Justice, AIJ, last year, after 2 decades of service as co-founder and executive director of the AIJ. Among many other honors, Robin was elected one of USA Today's Women of the Year for her work at AIJ. The Institute was originally founded with a focus on providing legal services for immigrants. Over time, AIJ also increased its portfolio to include climate justice, which is a distinctive priority for Robin. In my conversation with Robin today, I would like to explore the various dimensions of the work of AIJ. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
So let us begin with climate change. We are recording this episode in late October 2025, and just last week there was a massive storm that devastated coastal regions in Alaska. In the lower 48, as the rest of the country is, much of the rest of the country is known in Alaska and elsewhere in the world, most people took little notice of that. Can you tell us a bit about these recent climate effects in Alaska? Can you tell us a bit about what's going on in Alaska right now in this regard?
Yes, and my heart is broken because of the increasing impacts that the climate crisis is having in Alaska. As you mentioned, we are warming 4 times as fast as the lower 48. And so just a couple of weeks ago, Typhoon Halong came up the west coast of Alaska, devastated Alaska Native communities along the coast. 2,000 people have been displaced from their homelands, having to be evacuated by military helicopter and jet 500 miles away to Anchorage, Alaska, where I live. And this is not the first time a typhoon has impacted the west coast of Alaska. In fact, just 3 years ago, Typhoon Merbok roared up the west coast of Alaska, created devastation also. 40 Alaska Native communities were impacted, and a few families were displaced. So just in a short period of time, we have seen a dramatic impact in regard to the increased intensity of storms affecting our state.
Okay, we'll talk more about climate change, obviously, in this conversation. But for now, let's just take a step back. Can you tell us a bit about your background, about yourself, and perhaps in the process also tell us how you became a co-founder of the Alaska Institute for Justice a couple of decades ago?
Yeah, so I've worked as an immigration attorney in Alaska for approximately 25 years. And when I started that work, I worked at a Catholic Social Services, which was the only nonprofit in the state of Alaska at the time, focused on providing immigration legal services. I also started the Refugee Resettlement Program in Alaska, where we resettled hundreds of refugees every year. And in 2005, Catholic Social Services decided to close the immigration legal program, basically abandoning 1,200 people who were our clients. And so myself and my dear friend, coworker, collaborator, Mara Kimmel, we decided it was urgent that we open the Alaska Institute for Justice. At that time, we called ourselves the Alaska Immigration Justice Project, because there was no other place for immigrants and refugees to go to get comprehensive immigration legal services at a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. So many of our listeners, both in the United States and especially outside the United States, will have little sense of what happens in Alaska, what life in Alaska is like, who moves to Alaska. Can you tell us a bit more about what is the scene there? What is the immigrant and refugee situation? Under what circumstances do people come to Alaska as immigrants, as refugees, and what are there particular nations that they specifically come from?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, I live in Anchorage, Alaska, and Anchorage has been considered one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the United States. So, immigrants and refugees come from all over the world. In the late 1990s, when I started doing immigration legal work, I was specifically working with huge communities of people who were coming from primarily El Salvador, and they had migrated to Kodiak Island, which is an island off the coast of Alaska. And there are, because of the fish processing industry there, and a lot of immigrants have moved to Alaska because of the fish processing industry. And then refugees have been coming to our state, again, for decades. When I was doing the refugee resettlement work, it was primarily from Ukraine and Russia. And then the Hmong, who were fleeing the closing of a Wat in Thailand. And now people are coming from Africa and other parts of the world as refugees, and then, of course, as immigrants as well.
Okay. Yeah. So one interesting difference between your institute and the Carr-Ryan Center is, of course, that we are embedded in a university, and so our mandate is slightly different. We can't be as focused on advocacy in particular cases as you are. So advocacy is very much what you do at AIJ. Can you tell us a bit? So this AIJ is a non-for-profit organization, and it's hard to found them. It's hard to sustain them. How did you manage? How did the stars align so that you could pull it off? And how did you manage to sustain an organization with this kind of role?
Yes, you are right. It is not easy. And it's taken teamwork. So I have worked with an incredible team of people who are extremely creative, strategic, and committed to our mission, which is to protect the human rights of Alaskans. And so first, we're the only nonprofit in the state of Alaska that represents immigrants and refugees, and we have prioritized working with immigrants who are survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. So that in and of itself has made us stand out in the nonprofit world. And then our priority is to represent asylum seekers. And so because those have been our two priorities with the immigration legal program, it has enabled us to get access to the funding that we need to make sure that those populations we have the resources to represent those populations at no cost. And then we've diversified. So we have a sliding fee scale to represent the other folks who come, who need our services for, like, instance, naturalization or family-based reunification. And then, as you mentioned, we've focused on our mission to protect human rights. The Language Interpreter Center was started 2 years after we opened the Alaska Institute for Justice in 2005 to make sure that the clients we served had access to professional interpreters and could access all the resources that they needed as they were arriving in Alaska and needing to access those resources.
And how did you just to kind of understand since I'm myself running in institutions, I'm always eager to understand how people build institutions. How did you come by these translators? Did they happen to live in Alaska, or are these volunteers who turned themselves into more professional translators? How did you manage to do that?
So the first part was for us to have a community-wide conversation to acknowledge that there was a problem in regard to the lack of qualified interpreters and translators who were being used by the Alaska court system, for instance, or social service agencies or medical providers. And the Alaska court system, we've done a lot of advocacy with the Alaska court system. And so I believe it was 2005, maybe 2006, the Alaska court system decided this was their priority also. And they held a number of interpreter summits, and they brought together a diverse group of federal, state government agencies, nonprofit organizations, across all of the disciplines I just mentioned. And they collectively decided that getting qualified interpreters, translators was a priority, and they wanted to house the institute, Translator Interpreter Institute at the Alaska Institute for Justice, and provided funding to make that happen. And then we've only worked with bilingual Alaskans. So we work with bilingual Alaskans. And as I already said, we live in a really diverse state. So we did a lot of advertising. We provided free training. We worked with an incredible trainer in the beginning called Holly Mickelson, who's based in California. And she came up and provided free training to bilingual Alaskans. And I'm including Alaska Native languages also in the work that we do in order to create this professional class of bilingual Alaskans who could provide interpreter and translator resources to the various agencies wanting to serve the Alaska Native community as well as the immigrant and refugee community.
Okay, so it's a really a very forward-looking, strategically oriented project.
Yes, well, that's what we always are, forward-looking, and again, just abiding by our human rights. Like if your first language is not English, you can't access any of the services that you need, whatever they may be. And there was no other entity at the time who was looking at that issue and providing the services that were needed. And so it was, with both starting the Immigration Legal Program and the Language Interpreter Center, it was a community-wide effort that said, we need this as a community, and this is the institution, the nonprofit that we want to house these services in. So it wasn't just me making this decision, it was the community coming together and saying, these are priority services for our state, and this is the place where we want the services to be provided.
Okay, well, and so then after that, the AIJ also added the Alaska Climate Justice Program. How did it come to that? I mean, that seems like something quite different from the focus on migrants and refugees.
Yeah, so at the time, so this is now 20 years ago, and 20 years ago, it was very obvious the climate crisis was happening in Alaska. There were huge wildfires happening in our state, unprecedented, 6 million acres burning every summer when on average we'd had 1 million. And I didn't have a science background. And so I decided I wanted to go back to school to just learn the science. And at the time that I went back to school to learn the science, one Alaska Native tribe, Newtok, was in the process of beginning a community-wide relocation effort because of the climate crisis, because of thawing permafrost, accelerating rates of erosion, and extreme flooding. And so I decided to get a PhD, and my question that I asked was, are the political refugees that I represented as an immigration attorney, is there any commonality, similarity with the, at that time, and it's still the popularized term, climate refugees? And I decided that there was no commonality between those two. I thought it was a giant misnomer to use that word, climate refugees, and actually created a word, climigration, to talk specifically about this internal movement of people, so internal displacement, where you have entire communities no longer able to stay where they are currently located, And I was specifically looking at coastal regions, which are going to be permanently and are being permanently submerged, and realizing at that time that and still now, 20 years later, there's no governance institution in the United States that can handle a community-wide relocation and facilitate that process to get people to higher, safer ground. And so that was the subject of my research. I am still super passionate about it, and really focusing on Alaska Native tribal sovereignty and human rights protections. And slowly we started getting funding to do our work. So my intention initially was not to do this work and have funding as part of the agency, but because it was so cutting edge what we were doing and are doing, that we started getting funding not only from philanthropic foundations, but also, for instance, from the National Science Foundation. And that funding went to tribal governments so that they could hire staff to work with us on climate adaptation issues.
So let me just understand the point about the climate refugees a bit better. You did not like the term, and you still do not like the term because it sounds like people are coming from far away. So it's kind of not appreciating this phenomenon of kind of relocation that happens basically very close to where people originally lived, or what's the concern about the term climate refugees?
So in my experience as working as an immigration attorney, one of the, in my mind, foundational principles to getting refugee status is that your government, the government of where you're living, is persecuting you or torturing you or not protecting you from other entities within your country that are harming you. And with the climate crisis, we should expect our countries, our governments to protect us. Like that, right? Climate adaptation, you need government support in order to implement whatever your adaptation strategy is. So just from that perspective, it just felt like inappropriate because of that primary definition of being a refugee, where your government or an actor within your country the government cannot control or is not willing to control is persecuting or torturing you. And in the climate crisis, that governments need to step up and provide those resources so that people can adapt and communities can adapt.
Okay. So one other occasion to step back a little bit. So we have now talked about Alaska Native communities, indigenous people in Alaska, which is also a subject on which many of our listeners will not know terribly much. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the indigenous population of Alaska?
Yes, so there are 229 federally recognized tribes in Alaska. And more than half of the federally recognized tribes in the United States. And what that means is each tribe has a tribal government that has government to government relationships with the US federal government. So as an example, an Alaska Native tribal government can go directly to the president to ask for a disaster declaration and does not need to go through the state government where that tribe is located. Many of the tribes in Alaska are located off our road system, and that the only way that you can get to these communities is like, so if I'm going to go to one of the communities that we work with, I live in Anchorage, I take a jet for an hour to a place called Bethel, which is considered a hub community because there are several thousand people who live there. And then I take a small 10-seater plane for anywhere from a half hour to an hour to get out to the communities that we work with. The communities are primarily harvesting the foods from where they live. So they are hunting and fishing to sustain themselves and get the nutrition and the food security that they need. And many of these communities have minimal infrastructure. And what I mean by that is They do not have running water in their homes. They go to a central location to get the water that they need. And their communities, like in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, their first language is Yupik, not English. And so having an interpreter is critical to work with the Alaska Native villages.
Well, so just one thing, as you said, in Alaska, one does a lot of traveling by plane, right? So it's the view from the lower 48. I mean, we all kind of know Alaska is huge, but it's just important also to understand Alaska is 2.5 times as big as Texas, and it's mostly mountains, right? So often from A to B, the only way to get there, there's train connections somewhere. There's obviously highways, but typically to get from A to B is, as you say, one has to take a couple of planes, right, and maybe a boat in order to even reach the communities you're working with, right?
Yes, well, and in the YK Delta, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, it's one of the largest deltas in the world, and there are no mountains there. It's this large extent of marshy wetlands and lakes, which on permafrost. And so that's why, and that was one of the regions that was severely impacted by Typhoon Halong a couple of weeks ago. Because there is no higher ground and there are no evacuation roads, which is why people had to be evacuated by military helicopter and planes.
Okay. So now this nexus between human rights and climate change has played a large role in the human rights world in recent times. So among other things, the United Nations has recognized a human right to a healthy and sustainable environment in recent years. The UN has also emphasized that the connections go both ways. So a healthy and sustainable environment is needed for people to have any use for any rights. And human rights, in turn, are needed to empower people to stand up to organized political and economic power that often wants to exploit the environment. How has this connection between human rights and climate change fed into concrete projects, or has it fed into concrete projects that you have done, that AIJ has done?
Yeah, so climate-forced relocations, community-wide relocations, in my mind, is the greatest human rights challenge related to the climate crisis. And in my mind, the most important human right to protect in this context is the right to self-determination, because what we know from not very distant history, recent history, is that governments have forcibly relocated populations all over the world. And in the United States, this happened in World War II, where they forcibly relocated the Unungan people from the Aleutian Islands and moved them thousands of miles to the south, and 10% of the population died as a consequence of that. So when I think of climate-forced relocations, it is essential that that right to self-determination is protected. And the way that we do that at the Alaska Institute for Justice and the Climate Justice Program is with any funding we receive, we provide funding to tribal governments so that they can hire the staff that they need to make sure that, one, tribal sovereignty is respected by any state and federal government entity that they are working with, and two, that the collective and individual human rights of that tribe are protected as they are navigating climate adaptation strategies, which may be protecting the place where they live or starting a relocation process because the place where they live is no longer habitable because of increasing erosion, permafrost thaw, and storm surges and flooding.
Okay. So how has this work been going in recent times? So in other words, how is the Institute faring under the second Trump administration, and how do you see the future of this work?
Well, so the current administration, we, as the Alaska Institute for Justice, we were partnered with Kipnuk, Alaska, on one of the EPA community change grants, that EPA program that the Biden administration created. And Kipnuk received $20 million through that grant process in late last year, the beginning of this year. And unfortunately, the Trump administration terminated that funding. So Kipnuk lost $20 million, which was going to be used to protect the community from storm surges and flooding. Because of, the project was supposed to start in March of this year. So the project would not have been able to protect the community from what just happened with the typhoon. And critical for that funding to provide protection to the community, because they had documented that what just happened was going to happen, and they needed that protection to protect their community from accelerating erosion on their riverbank. FEMA has stepped up and with Typhoon Halong and been providing, my understanding is, a lot of services to the displaced people by the typhoon, which is critical and deeply appreciated, because
that's good to hear.
FEMA is essential. In the work that we did with the Biden administration, FEMA high-level FEMA administrators came to a workshop that we had in 2023 with the Alaska Native communities, and those administrators, along with other federal government agencies, listened deeply to the stories being told by the Alaska Native tribes we work with about how the climate crisis was impacting their communities, and changes were being made at the policy level within FEMA to make it easier for those communities to access resources. And unfortunately, that work is not continuing with this administration.
Okay, wow. So just for our non-American listeners, so FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, so basically the Federal Disaster Management Agency, which is among these many agencies that are getting downsized quite considerably at this stage, and with obviously with effects very much felt in Alaska as we speak, right?
Yes, but fortunately, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has been in Alaska providing essential services to the people who have been displaced, and also doing assessments about the extent of the damage in the communities that were impacted most recently by the typhoon.
Okay. So I originally, as we're coming to the concluding question, I originally meant to ask you what gives you hope, but you are a much more pragmatic spirit than that, Robin. So you suggested I ask you something different, namely, what actions can we take? What actions can individuals and communities take to adapt to the climate crisis? What can we do next?
Yes, well, and that would give me hope, because hope without action doesn't get you very far. And so what I hope that people understand is that with the climate crisis, the places where we live are in the process of changing dramatically. And this is a nonlinear process, which means that the climate crisis is accelerating, with the hurricanes and the typhoons increasing in strength. So what I think one of the most important things people can do in their communities is start documenting those changes. And for instance, flooding. If you are in a community that floods, document now where that flooding is happening, whether it be from storm surges or extreme rain precipitation events. You need to understand now and provide that information to your local government, so that your local government, and there are communities around the United States that are doing this, so that the local governments are getting on the ground real data and information to understand how the climate crisis is affecting really specific ecosystems and communities, because that's the information you need to adapt. We, using regional models is not helpful, because what's happening is on a very local scale. So you need that data in order to make adaptation strategies relevant, and not only for now, but into the future. Because as I said, this is a non-linear accelerating process. And as we in the United States and other countries in the world are not reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we are now facing higher thresholds than that 1.5 degree that the UNFCCC stated was the threshold that we weren't going to cross. And some scientists say we've already crossed it. So we need this data in order to be able to adapt for the long term.
Okay, well, any parting thoughts for our listeners, Robin?
I would say, as I said, that the climate forced relocation is the most intense human rights challenge related to the climate crisis. And specifically, if you are in a coastal community, it is urgent that you start working to figure out how your community is going to adapt to rising sea levels, because land will be permanently submerged.
Thank you, Robin Bronen, for joining us today on Justice Matters. And thanks to our podcast team, Kyle Verneuf, Meg Foley-Yoda, and Peter Kokoma. Justice Matters is a podcast production of the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights at Harvard Kennedy School. The podcast co-hosts are Minta Awesome, Diego Garcia-Bloom, Maggie Gates, and myself, Mathias Risse. You can find more information about the podcast on our website, easy to find if you Google the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights. Thank you for listening to Justice Matters.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.